You all know about shiny Pokémon, a 1 in 8,192 chance of finding these elusive creatures, or for the youngest, 1 in 4,096. Rarity in Pokémon is very common, as a lot of elements in the game are connected to it. In this Iceberg, we'll explore the most insane aspects of rare occurrences in Pokémon games, from wild encounters to things that would never happen in all the time the universe has existed. Welcome to the Iceberg of the rarest occurrences in the history of Pokémon.
Say my name. Eisenberg. You're goddamn right.
Sheer Cold. One-hit KO moves, as their name imply, can defeat an opponent in a single hit. However, their accuracy is very low at 30% in most cases. That means that this attack will only land 1 in every 3 tries approximately, making it an unreliable move, especially in competitive Pokémon. It's worth noting that this only applies if the user is an Ice type. If not, the accuracy goes down to 20%. If so, the chance of landing this attack is 1 in 5. This makes Sheer Cold, used by a non-Ice type Pokémon, the lowest accuracy move in the whole series without any modifiers. Accuracy and evasion modifiers. We've seen that one of the least accurate moves in Pokémon is Sheer Cold, used by a non-Ice type Pokémon like Suicune. But what if we apply accuracy and evasion modifiers? Under normal circumstances, a Pokémon's accuracy is 3/3 or 100%. If an opponent attacks us with Sand Attack, the accuracy is now 3/4, and if the move is used once again, it becomes 3/5 and so on, until the user's accuracy drops 6 stages to be 3/9 or simplified, 1/3. This means that the affected Pokémon has a 1 in 3 chance of connecting a 100% accuracy move. However, we're talking about one of the least accurate moves in the game. On top of that, if the opponent also had access to a move like Double Team, things get complicated for the Sheer Cold user. If you were to have a Suicune whose accuracy dropped 6 stages and the opponent has +6 in evasion, the chance of Sheer Cold hitting an opponent at the same level as Suicune would be 1 in 45. Critical hits. Critical hits are as old as Pokémon itself, but the way they work nowadays has drastically changed. From Gen 2 to 5, these hits would inflict double the damage on the opponent, but from Generation 6 onward, they only inflict 1.5 times damage. However, back in Generation 1, a level 5 Pokémon, for example, would inflict about 1.5 times damage, a level 21 1.8, and a level 95 1.95. Also, critical hits were directly tied to the Pokémon speed, meaning that a really fast Pokémon like Electrode would land critical hits 1/4 of the times, while slow Pokémon such as Rhydon would rarely inflict double the damage. Although the formula has changed from Generation 7 onward, the odds of landing a critical hit without any modifier is 1 in 24. Shiny Pokémon in the Space World 97 demo. Shiny Pokémon date all the way back to 1997, when the sequel of Red, Blue and Yellow was presented in a prototype. When encountering wild Pokémon, there's roughly a 1 in 50 chance of finding these special creatures, which is not even close to being as rare as the shiny Pokémon we ended up with. In fact, I think it would have been kind of boring and we wouldn't have the same video reactions to finding this rare Pokémon at all. Also, the shininess of a Pokémon was determined by its standard palette, meaning that all green Pokémon would be brown in their shiny form, regardless of what Pokémon it is, due to the technical limitations of the system back then. Cable car occurrences in Gen 3. Something that not a lot of people know is that both Poochyena and Zigzagoon were supposed to appear while the player is riding the cable in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald respectively. The chances of this happening would have been 1 in 64, but due to a programming error, they're nowhere to be found. Nonetheless, there's a camper, a hiker and a picnicker that do show up when you use the cable car, and the chances are the same, 1 in 64. Breeding shiny Pokémon in Gen 2. I remember that when I found my first shiny Pokemon ever, a shiny Phanpy in the Safari Zone in Pokemon Sapphire, I wondered if by breeding it with another Pokemon would increase the chances of having a shiny Pokemon. This wasn't the case in Generation 3, but what I didn't know is that this did have an effect in Gold, Silver and Crystal. If you try breeding a shiny Pokemon with any other, the odds of getting an egg that will produce a shiny Pokemon is 1 in 64, one of the best odds in any game. However, it was still a painful thing to do because hatching an egg in Gen 2 took an extremely long time even riding your bike. Although chances in future games aren't as good as this, the fact that you can hatch eggs way faster like in Scarlet and Violet makes these games easier to get these rare Pokemon. Wild Encounters. Wild encounters are one of the most common occurrences in Pokemon, but not all of them are made equal. Pokemon such as Caterpie, Pidgey and Magikarp are easy to find, and sometimes they're the only Pokemon you can find with a 100% encounter. However, starting in Pokemon Red, Blue and Yellow, we can already see rare encounters as low as 1%. For example, Dragonair in Pokemon Yellow using the Super Rod. This translates to a 1 in 100 chance of finding one of the fewest dragons in existence back in the 90s. Catching Feebas in Gen 3. I remember the pain of trying to catch Feebas in Pokemon Sapphire. My understanding of the game mechanics was lacking, and I would spend hours fishing on the same spot thinking I would get a Feebas on Route 119. What I didn't know is that this weak Pokemon only appears in 6 out of 446 styles suitable for fishing. Taking this into account, the odds of finding Feebas are 1 in 74, but if we also consider that its encounter rate is 50% or 1 in 2, that makes the chance of finding a Feebas 1 in 148. Catching legendary Pokemon with a Pokeball. Do you remember how sometimes your Pokeball would fail if you threw it at a legendary Pokemon at full HP in Generation 1? That's because even if you threw a Pokeball at a legendary Pokemon with 1 HP and a status condition using an Ultra Ball, the chance of catching that Pokemon is less than 15%. Now, the chance of catching a legendary Pokemon with no status condition at full HP is around 0.53% or a 1 in 188 chance, so definitely the best way to catch them is using a Master Ball or an Ultra Ball while they're at low HP and frozen or asleep. In this way, your chance of catching them is around 23% or almost a 1 in 4 chance. Critical hits and status condition in the same turn. We've talked about critical hits and their chance of landing, but for the sake of simplicity, let's stick to modern mechanics. Nowadays, the chance of a critical hit occurring is 1 in 24. If we add the likelihood of inflicting a status condition, let's say freezing an opponent with Ice Beam, which happens 1 out of 10 times, this means that the odds of landing a critical hit on an opponent while freezing it with Ice Beam are 1 in 240. Gen 1 Miss. The infamous Gen 1 Miss. In Pokemon, moves have a certain accuracy that normally ranges between 30 and 100%. As expected, 100% accuracy attacks never miss unless evasion or accuracy are modified. However, in Gen 1, attacks with 100% accuracy have a 1 in 256 chance of missing due to a flaw in the formula that calculates accuracy. When using an attack, the game generates a number between 0 and 255. The idea for 100% accuracy moves is that if the generated number is less or equal to 255, the move will hit, assuring that it won't miss. However, due to an error, the formula states that the move will hit only if the number is less than 255, meaning that if the number happens to be precisely 255, the move will actually fail. All in all, 100% accuracy moves have, in reality, a 99.6% chance of hitting. This doesn't apply for moves such as Swift, as they completely skip the formula in order to always hit. people went crazy about shiny Pokémon, and many of them were desperately looking for ways to increase the odds of finding one. Game Freak co-founder Junichi Masuda described this method on his blog back in December 2007. This method was included in order to incentivize using the GTS in Diamond and Pearl, and it would multiply by 4 the original odds of hatching a shiny Pokémon by breeding 2 Pokémon from different languages. This means that the odds of hatching a shiny Pokémon with the Masuda method are around 1 in 2048. Chansey holding a lucky egg. Chansey is a rare Pokémon in Gold, Silver and Crystal, given that it has a 1% encounter ratio. If we add the fact that it has a 2% chance of holding a lucky egg, that makes finding Chansey holding a lucky egg a 1 in 5,000 chance. If you feel lucky, the chance of finding this Pokémon holding a lucky egg in its shiny form is 1 in 40,960,000. Original shiny Pokémon. 1 in 8,192. That is the chance of finding a shiny Pokémon between generations 2 and 5. Back when I knew about this, I thought that if I had encountered 8,191, the next one would be guaranteed to be a shiny, but I was so wrong. In fact, even after 8,191 encounters, the odds are still 1 in 8,192. This has led unlucky shiny hunters to encounter wild Pokémon tens of thousands of times before finding their target. It's worth noting that it's completely possible to shiny hunt in Generation 1, even though shiny Pokémon aren't programmed in those games, since shiny Pokémon are determined by their DVs or individual values as we know them today in Gen 1 and 2. If you find a Pokémon in red, blue or yellow with specific stats, you can tell if it's a shiny or not, even if it doesn't show in those games. However, once you transfer them to a Gen 2 game, you'll see that it's always been a shiny Pokémon. This is the only way to have, for example, a shiny Mewtwo, a Pokémon that is impossible to catch in Gen 2. Shiny Manaphy. I've spoken about shiny Manaphy plenty of times, and we know that there are certain ways to make this way easier, but let's stick to the old school method of getting a shiny Manaphy from an egg. Game Freak tried to prevent Manaphy from ever hatching shiny from an egg in Generation 4, but if you trade it to another Gen 4 game, the shiny luck could be overridden because it would try to prevent shininess using the ID numbers of the game that originally received it, but not from a different core series game. This would actually cause the Manaphy to look normal during the shiny animation, but be shiny in reality. If I'm talking about this Pokémon, it's not because the odds of getting a shiny Manaphy are 1 in 8,192 as other Pokémon, but due to the outrageous fact that you can only get a single Manaphy egg from an individual copy of Pokémon Ranger, something that happens after finishing the main game. You might think that you can just start the game all over and get the egg once again, but this is not the case. If the egg is not shiny when you hatch it after transferring it to a Gen 4 main game and trade it to another one, that's it. A way to stand a chance to get a shiny Manaphy with the same egg is by starting a new adventure with a Gen 4 game and trade the egg to that game, hatch and hope it's a shiny. If not, rinse and repeat. SOS Salamence in Sun and Moon. Bagon is a rare Pokémon with a 1% encounter rate on Route 3 in the Alola region. Now, an SOS battle happens when a wild Pokémon calls for help and a Pokémon shows up to help said Pokémon. Bagon is capable of calling several Pokémon, however, the rarest of them is Salamence, which only happens 1% of the times. This means that the odds of encountering an SOS battle Salamence in Pokémon Sun and Moon on Route 3 are 1 in 10,000. Mirage Island. As I probably explained in my Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald Iceberg, a Phantom Island is a location that is said to have been seen by explorers at some point in history, but that after exploring the surrounding areas, the island is nowhere to be found. An example of this is Bermeja Island, supposedly located in Mexico, reported to have existed in the 16th century, but later confirmed as inexistent in 2009. If I'm talking about this, is because there's something similar in Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire Sapphire and Emerald in the form of Mirage Island. There's an old man in Pacific Lock Town that says he's not able to see Mirage Island, and in fact, I never got to see the island after playing the Gen 3 games for several years, and there's a good reason for that. The chance of seeing and visiting the island lies on the first 2 bytes of the personality value of any Pokemon in your party, and a random number between 0 and 65,535 generated every day. There's a misunderstanding in the chance of seeing this island because we generally think that it's always 1 in around 65,000. Nonetheless, this is only true if the player has only 1 Pokemon in their party. If the player has 6, the odds are 6 times higher, meaning that normally a player's chance of seeing and visiting Mirage Island is 1 in 10,923. Weak Pokemon escaping Pokeball. We have a tendency of talking about how difficult it is to catch a Pokemon, but very rarely about how easy it is to catch one. Let's take a level 3 Caterpie as an example in Generation 3 or 4. Did you know that if that Caterpie has at least 29% of its HP and a status condition, even a Pokeball is guaranteed to catch it? Nonetheless, if the Pokemon in question has 29% of its HP but with no status condition, the chance of catching it with a Pokeball is 99.994%. This means that Caterpie has a 1 in 16,667 chance of escaping. Pokerus. Although Pokerus debuted in Gold and Silver, I didn't know until I saw it when I caught a Swalot in Pokemon Sapphire infected with this virus. This was also very useful to EV train your Pokemon at double the speed, and I was also lucky that some other Pokemon got infected too, because it can disappear after a while, and if no other Pokemon in your game was infected, Pokerus is gone for good. If you thought that shiny Pokemon are rare, Pokerus puts them to shame, as the chance of getting your Pokemon infected with this is 1 in 21,845. Although there's no way to see if a Pokemon is infected with it in Scarlet and Violet, the data that indicates this information is still present in the Pokemon's data structure. Squared shiny Pokemon. Squared shiny Pokemon refer to a type of shiny Pokemon introduced in Sword and Shield that have square-shaped sparkles and are rarer than normal shinies. The odds of finding one of these Pokemon are 1 in 65,535, 16 times rarer than normal shinies from Generation 6 onward. Gen 1 miss in Pokemon Stadium. Pokemon Stadium tried to fix a lot of the issues present in Pokemon Red, Blue and Yellow, such as focus energy, reducing the ratio of critical hits by 4 times instead of doubling it. The same attempt was made to correct the Gen 1 miss so that 100% accuracy moves always hit. This, for some reason, was done by generating the same flawed formula twice. A number between 0 and 255 will be generated. If the generated number happens to be 255, a Gen 1 miss occurs. However, if this happens, the game re-rolls the number in an attempt to ensure the second roll is not 255 again. Since the re-roll is using the same flawed formula, that second attempt also has a 1 in 256 chance of generating a Gen 1 miss, meaning that a Gen 1 miss in Pokemon Stadium has a chance of 1 in 65,536 chance of missing. There's a video by a YouTuber called Mysticor where the extremely rare Gen 1 miss in Pokemon Stadium happens, an occurrence 8 times rarer than finding a shiny Pokemon. Lottery. Winning the Lotto ID in Pokemon can be a bit tricky because it depends on how many Pokemon from different trainers you have, but supposing you only have one and you're expecting to win a Master Ball, meaning 5 matching numbers, the odds of getting a second Master Ball in your game is 1 in 100,000. Winning the Lotto ID is based on the numbers in the trainer ID of any Pokemon in your possession, and these trainer IDs can range from 00000 to 65,535. 5. If this is the case, wouldn't this last number be the same odds of winning the lottery? It would be, but since the Lotto ID generates numbers between 00000 and 99,999, this makes it a 1 in 100,000 chance of winning. This means that if the Lotto ID generates the number 88,888, no Pokemon can ever win the lottery. Munchlax in Gen 4. There are 21 golden trees in Pokemon Diamond, Pearl and Platinum, where the player can slather honey for a chance to encounter a wild Pokemon 6 hours later. Munchlax is a Pokemon with a 1% encounter rate, and it wouldn't be that different from finding a Dragonair in Pokemon Yellow by fishing, if it weren't for the fact that this Pokemon only appears in 4 random trees out of the 21 in the entire region. Unfortunately, there's no way to know which trees can spawn Munchlax, because this is determined by your trainer and secret ID, a number the player has no way to know through normal means. First of all, the chance of coming across a Munchlax tree is around 1 in 5, even though you won't really know it. On top of that, finding a Munchlax on that tree is a 1 in 100 chance, meaning that the odds of getting the right tree and also finding Munchlax is 1 in 525. What makes this search more frustrating is that you need to wait for 6 hours to even encounter a single Pokemon using this method, so just get a Snorlax with full incense to get a Munchlax egg. However, if you like pain, you might want to shiny hunt a Munchlax using the honey method. If so, your chance is 1 in 4,300,800. Back-to-back shiny Pokemon. If shiny Pokemon are rare in their own right, finding 2 back-to-back is certainly extremely unlikely. It's so rare that you are 14,000 times more likely to be struck by lightning than what happened to YouTuber Sheffer922. He was shiny hunting in Pokemon Sapphire when he found a shiny Torkoal. Once caught, he jokingly said he would get 2 in a row. To everybody's surprise, the very next Pokemon he finds is a shiny Numel. We can be certain that he wasn't using any cheating devices, as he shows his Game Boy Advance SP with no signs of external devices, and the reaction is just priceless. No wonder, as the odds of this occurring are 1 in 67,108,864. Shiny Pokemon in Pokemon Colosseum. As I explained in other icebergs, shiny Pokemon in Pokemon Colosseum can be a bit confusing. Let's suppose that you're in a battle against a trainer that has a shadow Pokemon. This shadow Pokemon have a 1 in 8,192 chance of being shiny, but there's a catch. The Pokemon that the NPC sends into battle has a trainer ID and secret ID numbers that determine if that Pokemon will be shiny or not. If it's shiny, you'll see it appear like that as soon as the opponent sends it into battle. You might think that once you catch it, you'll have a shiny Pokemon in your collection, but this is far from the truth. The thing is that when you catch the Pokemon, the numbers that determine if the Pokemon is shiny no longer belong to the NPC, but to your trainer and secret ID numbers. In other words, the numbers that determine shininess re-roll when you catch it, meaning that when you catch a Pokemon that is shiny in battle, it won't be in your party. Of course, the opposite can happen. You can catch a shadow Pokemon that is not shiny and see that it turned into a shiny once in your team. However, the odds of catching a shiny shadow Pokemon and still being shiny after you catch it are the same as finding 2 shiny Pokemon in a row. That is 1 in 67,108,864. Shiny rare Mark Dunsparce. In Scarlet and Violet, Dunsparce has a 1 in 100 chance of evolving into a 3-segment Dunsparce instead of only 2. If you combine that with the Pokemon having a rare mark, a 1 in 1000 chance, the odds of getting this Pokemon is 1 in 100,000, way less likely than a shiny Pokemon. But what if we want this Pokemon to be shiny as well? We need to multiply 100,000 by 4096 if we don't have the shiny charm, and the chance of this happening is 1 in 409,600,000. Somebody actually got a shiny Dunsparce with the rare mark to evolve into a 3-segment Dunsparce, although by using a shiny power 3 sandwich and the shiny charm, the chance increased to 1 in 68,300,000. Perfect IVs. Pokémon are quite different, even among same species at the same level. Two level 100 Mewtwo can be drastically different when it comes to their battle capabilities, as a Mewtwo with a speed hindering nature, 0 IVs and 0 effort values will have a speed of 323, and the Mewtwo with a speed beneficial nature, 31 IVs and 252 EVs will have a speed of 394. Since Pokémon can have individual values that range between 0 and 31, and each Pokémon has 6 stats, the odds of having a Pokémon with perfect IVs are 1 in 1,073,741,824. Shiny Pokémon in a wild double battle. Finding 2 shiny Pokémon back to back is basically a miracle, as it's a 1 in around 67 million chance. This is exactly the same odds of finding 2 shiny Pokémon in a double battle, as the same principle applies. However, things can get even more unlikely if we want to find 2 shiny Pokémon of the same species in the same double battle. This is an example by C. Willy HD, where he states the odds of finding 2 shiny Bonnery in the same battle. Considering that the odds of finding these 2 Pokémon at the same time is 1 in 27, we need to multiply the odds of finding 2 shiny Pokémon in the same battle. Considering that the odds of finding these 2 Pokémon at the same time is 1 in 27, we need to multiply that by the odds of finding 2 shiny Pokémon in the same battle. That is 27 times 67,108,864, resulting in a 1 in 1,812,000,000 chance of this happening. Of course, this happened with the aid of cheating devices to demonstrate that. If this unlikely event occurs in Diamond and Pearl when meeting with Cheryl in Eterna Forest, the game will freeze. No wild encounter in 230 steps. I think that so far, this is by far the wildest thing that has ever happened to anyone in Pokémon. In Gen 1, every time you walk on tall grass, the chance of generating an encounter is 30 in 256, around 11.7% of the times. The odds of not generating one are 1 or 256 in 256 minus that number, meaning 226 in 256, or approximately 88.3% of the times. This means that most of the times you won't get an encounter. YouTuber Shenanagans Smash recorded one of the most unlikely things to happen in the history of Pokémon, and it all happened in the Safari Zone in Pokémon Red, where he walked into 230 grass tiles without generating a single encounter. Although not generating an encounter on a single tile is the most likely outcome, with around an 88% chance, not generating one 230 times in a row is around 1 in 3.1 trillion. Same pattern Spinda. Spinda is a peculiar Pokémon introduced in Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald, and that's because Spinda's spot pattern is determined by its personality value that can generate up to 4,294,967,295 different numbers. This means that the odds of finding 2 Spinda with the same spot pattern are 1 in 4,294,967,296. Multi-stride attacks landing 5 critical hits. Multi-strike moves include attacks that can hit 2 to 5 times, such as Fury Swipes. First of all, Fury Swipes has an 80% chance of hitting at all. Once it hits, the second strike has a 35% chance of connecting, and the third a 35% as well. The fourth hit is even less common at 15%, same as the fifth one. This leaves us with a chance of 0.162% or 1 in 617 times. Very rare, but not extremely uncommon. However, if we want to connect 5 consecutive critical hits, that's when it gets crazy. Considering that critical hits occur 4.17% of the times, or 1 in 24, we would need to multiply 617 by 24 to the 5th power. The result would be 1 in 4,912,939,008, even rarer than finding a Spinda with the same spot patterns. Shiny Horde. Horde encounters were introduced in Pokémon X and Y, and they refer to wild battles between the trainer's Pokémon and 5 opponents at once. Shiny Pokémon from Gen 6 onward have a 1 in 4096 chance of appearing, and we already know what it takes to encounter 2 of these Pokémon in a row. What about 5 of them? Well, we need to multiply 4096 to the power of 5 to find out. The chance of this ever happening is 1 in 1 quintillion, 152 quadrillion, 921 trillion, 504 billion, 606 million, 846,976. That's the same as winning the Powerball 4 million times in a row. Rage Softlock in Red, Blue and Yellow. This softlock was made popular by Pikaspray, and it consists in saving the game in front of Lorelei, challenging her with a weak to psychic low-level Pokémon that only knows Rage. Rage is a move that once it connects, the Pokémon will never stop using it, and its power points will never be depleted until it faints. The trick here is that due to a flaw in how the AI works, your opponent will always prioritize super effective moves, even if they don't inflict any damage. If you have, for example, a fighting Pokémon and your opponent knows Rest, a non-damaging psychic move, it will spam it because the game thinks that that's the best decision. Due to yet another programming error, power points don't apply for enemy Pokémon and they can be used indefinitely. This is exemplified in a battle between a low-level Primeape that only knows Rage and a Dugong that will spam Rest. Primeape's Rage attack is never enough to knock out Dugong, due to the fact that this Pokémon is always healing itself before it's even close to being defeated. This fight is virtually infinite and considered a softlock. However, a third programming error in Gen 1 could give you a chance to escape this infinite loop. We've spoken about the infamous Gen 1 miss, a 1 in 256 chance of missing an attack that has 100% accuracy like Rage. The problem with Rage is that it will only deplete its HP if it misses, but once it connects, it will never stop. If the player wants to deplete Rage's power points until the Pokémon uses Struggle and knocks itself out, the user would need to miss Rage 20 times in a row and make it out of the Elite Four. What are the odds of this ever happening? Well, we've spoken about the Gen 1 miss in Pokémon Stadium. That is basically 2 Gen 1 misses in a row. The chance of that happening is 1 in 65,536. What about 20 times in a row? That would be 1 in around 1 quindecillion chance, or 10 to the power of 48. It is more likely to win the Powerball twice in a row every day for 100 billion years. The most unlikely thing in the history of Pokémon. We're gonna talk about Spinda, but with a twist. The thing is that there are so many variables with this scenario, so instead of talking about it, let's get into the ultimate question when it comes to the most unlikely event in the history of Pokémon. What are the odds of finding a horde of Spinda in Pokémon Omega Ruby or Alpha Sapphire, all female, shiny, with perfect IVs, same nature, same ability, same spot pattern, all of them with Pokéross? I'll let ChatGPT answer.
The chance of finding a horde of Spinda in Omega Ruby or Alpha Sapphire with all the conditions you listed is essentially impossible, but let's carefully go through the math in words. First, there is a 95% chance of the encounter being a Spinda horde. Each individual Spinda then needs to meet all of the following conditions. Female, which is a 1 in 2 chance. Shiny, which is a 1 in 4096 chance. Perfect individual values, which is a 1 in 1,073,741,824 chance. Modest nature, which is a 1 in 25 chance. The ability own tempo, which is a 1 in 2 chance. Infected with Pokémon, which is a 1 in 21,845 chance. Choose the move Tackle, which is a 1 in 4 chance, and that tackle being a critical hit, which is a 1 in 16 chance. To find the chance for a single Spinda, we multiply all of those probabilities together. 1/2 multiplied by 1 over 4096 multiplied by 1 over 1,073,741,824 multiplied by 1 over 25 multiplied by 1/2 multiplied by 1 over 21,845 multiplied by 1/4 multiplied by 1/16. That product gives a probability of roughly 1.6 times 10 to the negative 21st power for one Spinda. Because there are 5 Spinda in the Horde and all of them must satisfy these conditions, we then take that single Spinda probability raised to the 5th power. Next, we add the requirement that all 5 Spinda share the exact same spot pattern. There are 4,294,967,296 possible patterns. The first Spinda can have any pattern, but each of the remaining 4 must exactly match it. That means we multiply by the probability of 1 over 4,294,967,296 raised to the 4th power. Finally, we multiply everything by the 95% chance that the encounter was a Spinda horde to begin with. When you put all of this together, the final probability is about 3.17 times 10 to the negative 143rd power. In other words, the odds are approximately 1 in 3.15 times 10 to the power of 142. That is a number so astronomically small that, for all practical purposes, it is impossible.
To put it into perspective, the number of atoms in the universe is estimated to be 10 to the power of 80. A Planck time is the smallest time unit in the universe, and it's so small that if you try to make it smaller, the universe stops making sense. There has been around 8.1 times 10 to the power of 60 Planck times since the Big Bang. Well, even if you could check for this exact Spinda horde once per Planck time across every atom in the universe for the entire age of the universe, you'd still have almost zero chance of seeing it. Now, imagine if Tackle, instead of having 100% accuracy, it had 95% like in previous generations. Imagine if Spinda could also be encountered at 3 different levels instead of only at level 9. This would add 2 more variables to the equation, making this already unfathomably ridiculous scenario even more impossible. Thank you so much for watching. Remember that you can also become a member of the channel and learn about how to become a YouTuber. Last time I spoke about copyright, so for just a few dollars you can have access to this knowledge. Also, subscribe to the EisenBerg Experience, where I talk about all types of video game icebergs. See you in the next one.